Good morning. Welcome back to Ranger's Apprentice. When we last left them, they decided that they were going to follow the Wargles as they were marching their prisoners somewhere. So we'll see if that was a good idea. Okay. Following the Wargles was easier than they expected. The creatures were single-minded, concentrating only on the task in hand, which was to take the Celts miners to their end destination. They feared no attack in these parts, having already driven the occupants out, so they posted no forward scouts or sweepers. Their constant chanting, ominous as it might sound at first, also served to mask any sounds that might have been made by their pursuers. At night, they simply camped wherever they might find themselves to be. The miners remained chained together, and sentries were posted to keep watch over them while the rest of the group slept. By the beginning of the second day, Will began to have an idea of the direction the Wargles were headed. He had been riding some 30 meters in the lead, relying on Tug to sense any danger ahead. Now he dropped back a little, waiting for Horace and Evelyn to come level with him. "We seem to be heading for the fissure," he said, more than a little puzzled. Already in the distance they could make out high, brooding cliffs that towered over the other side of the massive split in the earth. Celtica itself was a mountainous country, but Morgorath's domain reared hundreds of meters above it. "I wouldn't care to come down those cliffs on ropes and scaling ladders," Horace said, nodding toward them. "Even if you did, you'd have to find a level space on the other side to cross from," Will agreed. "And apparently there are precious few of them. For the most part, the cliffs go straight down to the bottom." Evelyn looked from one to the other. "Yet Morgorath has done it once," she said. "Maybe he's planning to attack Arielon the same way." Horace brought his horse to a halt, considering what she had said. Will and Evelyn stopped beside him. He chewed his lip for a few seconds as he thought back over the lessons that Sir Rodney's instructors had dinned into him. Then he shook his head. "It's a different situation," he said finally. "The attack on Celtica was more of a raid than an invasion. He wouldn't have needed more than 500 men for that, and they could travel light. To attack Arielon, he'll need an army, and he wouldn't get an army down those cliffs and across with a few ladders and rope bridges." Will regarded him with interest. This was a side of Horace that was new to him. Apparently, Horace's learning curve in the past 7 or 8 months had gone beyond his mere skill with the sword. "But surely if he had enough time," he began. But Horace shook his head again, more decisively this time. "Man, yes, or Wargles in this case. Given enough time, they could get them down and across. It would take months, but you could manage it. Although the longer it took, the more chance word would get out about what they were doing." "But an army needs equipment, heavy weapons, supply wagons, provisions, tents, spare weapons, and blacksmith's equipment to repair them. Horses and oxen to pull the wagons. You'd never get all that down the cliffs like those. And even if you did, how would you get it across? It's just not feasible. Sir Carl used to say that." He realized the others were regarding him curiously, and he flushed. I didn't mean to go on," he mumbled, and he urged his horse forward again. But as Will followed, he was shaking his head, impressed by his friend's grasp of the subject. "Not at all," he said. "You're making good sense." Which still leaves us the question, what is he up to?" Evelyn said. Will shrugged. "I suppose we'll find out soon enough," he said, and urged Tug forward to take up the point position once more. They found out the following evening. As before, they heard the first hint as to what was taking place. The ring or thud of hammers striking stone or wood. Then there was another noise they drew closer, a constant but irregular cracking sound. Will signaled for the others to stop and dismount. He proceeded carefully along the last stretch of the road to the final bend. Shrouded in his cloak and moving carefully from one patch of cover to the next, he moved off the road and cut across country to find a vantage point from which to view the next stretch of road. Almost immediately, he saw the top of the massive wooden structure that was being constructed. 4 wooden towers linked by heavy rope cables and timber framework, reared above the surrounding countryside. His heart sinking, he already knew what he was looking at, but he moved closer to make sure. So what do you think he's looking at? It was as he feared. An immense wooden bridge was in the final stages of construction. On the far side of the fissure, Morgorath had discovered one of the few places where a narrow ledge ran, almost level with the Celtic side. The natural ledge had been dug out and widened until there was a sizable piece of level ground there. The 4 towers stood, 2 either side of the fissure, linked by massive rope cables. Supported by them, a wooden roadway was half completed, capable of taking 6 men abreast across the dizzying depths of the fissure. Figures recognizable as Celt prisoners swarmed over the structures, hammering and sawing. The cracking sound was made by the whips used by the Wargle overseers. Beyond them, the sound of hammers on stone came from the mouth of a tunnel that opened onto the ledge some 50 meters south of the bridge. It was little more than a crack in the cliff face, only a little wider than a man's shoulders, but as he watched, the Celt prisoners were hard at work at its entrance, gouging at the hard rock, widening and enlarging the small opening. Will glanced up at the dark cliffs towering on the other side. There was no signs of ropes or ladders leading down to the ledge. The Wargos and the prisoners must access it via the narrow crack in the rock, he reasoned. The party they had been following was crossing the fissure now. The final 15 meters of roadway was yet to be constructed, and only a temporary timber footway was in place. It was barely wide enough for the Celts to cross, tethered in pairs as they were, but the miners of Celtica were used to awkward footing and dizzying drops, and they crossed without incident. He had seen enough for the time being, he thought. It was time to go back. He wriggled his way backward into the cover of the broken rocks. Then, bending almost double, he ran back to where the others were waiting. When he reached them, he slumped down, leaning against the rocks. The tension of the last 2 days was beginning to tell on him, along with the strain of being in command. He was a little surprised to realize that he was physically exhausted. He had no idea that mental tension could sap a person's strength so thoroughly. "So what's going on? Did you see anything?" Horace said. Will looked up at him wearily. "A bridge," he told him. "They're building a huge bridge." Horace frowned, puzzled by it all. "A bridge?" he repeated. "Why would Morgreth want a bridge?" "It's a huge bridge," I said, "big enough to bring an army across. Here we've been discussing how Morgreth couldn't move an army and all its equipment down the cliffs and across the fissure, and all the time he's been building a bridge to do just that." Evelyn picked at the loose thread on her jacket. "That's why he wanted the Celts," she said. When both boys looked at her, she elaborated. "They're expert builders and tunnelers. His Wargles wouldn't have the skill for an undertaking like this." "They're tunneling too," Will said. "There's a narrow crack, sort of a cave mouth, in the far side that they're widening." "Where does it lead to?" Horace asked, and Will shrugged. "I don't know. It might be important to find out. After all, the plateau on the other side is still hundreds of feet above this point, but there must be some access between the two because there's no sign of ropes or ladders." Horace stood and began to pace back and forth as he considered this new information. His face was screwed up in thought. "I don't get it," he said finally. "It's not that hard to get, Horace," Will told him with some asperity. "There's a barking great bridge being built over the fissure, big enough for Morgorath and all his Wargles and their supply wagons and their blacksmiths and their oxen and Uncle Tom Cobley and all to come waltzing over." Horace waited until Will had finished his tirade. He was outwardly calm, but Evelyn could see a slight flush of anger on his face. He let the awkward silence stretch between them for some time, then said in a deceptively quiet voice, "You're quite finished, are you?" Will shifted uncomfortably in the saddle, realizing that he might have gone too far. "Well, yes," he said, making a vaguely apologetic gesture for Horace to continue. "What I don't get," Horace said, enunciating very carefully and with heavy emphasis, "is why it was never mentioned in those plans you captured." Evelyn looked up curiously. "Plans?" she said. "What plans?" But Will gestured for her to wait for an explanation. He realized that Horace had made a vital point and that the sarcastic response he had been planning was instantly dispelled. "You're right," he said softly. "The plans never mentioned a bridge across the fissure." "And it's not as if it's a small undertaking. You'd think it would be in there somewhere," Horace said. Will nodded agreement. Evelyn, her curiosity thoroughly piqued by now, repeated her question. "What are these plans you keep talking about?" Horace took pity on her. "Willen Holt, his craftmaster, captured a copy of Morgorath's battle plans a couple weeks ago. There was a lot of detail about how his forces were going to break out of the mountains via Three-Step Pass. There was even the date on which they were going to do it and how Scandian mercenaries were going to help him. Only there was no mention of this bridge." "Why not?" Evelyn asked. But Will was beginning to see what that Morgoth had in mind, and his horror was growing by the second. Sorry, I'm going to try to turn on a light. It's hard for me to see. There we go. All right. Well, now I lost my spot. Unless, he said, Morgoth wanted us to capture those plans. Oh, sorry, now this is all messed up. Oh, now you fell. Oh, now I got this going. All right. There we go. Will met his gaze evenly. Whoop. Unless, he said, Morgoth wanted us to capture those plans. That's crazy, Horus said instantly. After all, one of his men died as a result. Will met his gaze evenly. Would that stop Morgoth? He doesn't care about other people's lives. Let's think it through. Halt has a saying. When you can't see the reason for something, look for the possible result and ask yourself who might benefit from it. So, said Evelyn, what's the result of your finding those plans? King Duncan has moved the army to the plains of Uthal to block Three-Step Pass, said Horus promptly. Evelyn nodded and continued with the second part of the equation. And who might benefit from that? Will looked up at her. He could see she had reached the same conclusion he had, and at the same time. Very slowly, he said, Morgoth, if those plans were false. Evelyn nodded agreement. Horus was not quite so quick to see the point. False? What do you mean? I mean, said Will, Morgoth wanted us to find those plans. He wanted the Ariel army assembled at the plains of Uthal. The whole army. Because Three-Step Pass isn't where the real attack will come from. The real attack will come from here, a surprise attack from behind, and our army will be trapped and then destroyed. Horus's eyes widened in horror. He could envision the result of a massive attack from the rear. The Arielons would be caught between the Scandians and the Wargles in front of them, and another army of Wargles in the rear. It was a recipe for disaster, the kind of disaster every general feared. Then we gotta go tell them, he said, right away. Will nodded. We gotta tell them, but there's one more thing I want to see. That tunnel they're digging. We don't know if it's finished or half finished or where it goes. I want to take a look at it tonight. But Horus was shaking his head before he even finished. Will, we've got to go now, he said. We can't hang around here just to satisfy your curiosity. It was Evelyn who solved the argument. You're right, Horus, she said. The king must know about this as soon as possible, but we have to be sure that we're not taking him another red herring. The tunnel Will's talking about could be weeks away from completion, or it could lead to a dead end. This whole thing could be yet another ruse to convince the army to divert forces to protect their rear. We have to find out as much as possible. If that means waiting a few more hours, then I say we wait. Will glanced at the girl curiously. She certainly seemed to have a better grasp of strategy than one would expect from a lady's maid, and there was an unmistakable air of authority about her as well. He decided that Galan's theory was correct. It'll be dark in an hour, Horus. We'll go across tonight and take a closer look. Horus looked from one of his companions to the other. He wasn't happy. His instinct was to ride now as fast as he could and spread the word of this bridge. But he was outvoted, and he still believed Will's power of deduction were better than his. He was trained for action, not this sort of torturous thinking. Reluctantly, he allowed himself to be convinced. All right, he said, we'll look tonight, but tomorrow we leave. Wrapped in his cloak and moving carefully, Will returned to his former vantage point. He studied the bridge carefully, thinking that Halt would expect him to be able to draw an accurate plan of the structure. He hadn't been in position for more than 10 minutes when a horn blast rang out. He froze, terrified. For a moment he thought it was an alarm and that the alert sentry had spotted him moving among the rocks. Then he heard some cracking of whips and the grunting cries of the Wargles, and as he raised his head, he saw that they were driving the Celts off the bridge and back toward the half-finished tunnel. The prisoners, as they went, down their tools in stacks. Wargles began reshackling them to a central leash. Glancing up to the west, Will saw the last curve of the sun dropping behind the hills, and he realized that the horn had simply been sounding the end of the working day. Now the prisoners were being returned to wherever it was they were kept. There was one brief altercation, a few meters from the tunnel mouth, as two of the Celt prisoners stopped to try to lift a prone figure that lay there. Angrily, the Wargle guards surged forward, beating the miners away with their whips and forcing them to leave the still figure where it lay. Then, one after the other, they filed through the narrow entrance of the tunnel and disappeared. The shadows of the huge bridge lengthened across the hillside. Will remained unmoving for about another 10 minutes, waiting to see if any wargles reemerged from the tunnel. But there was no sound, no sign of anyone returning. Only the still form lying by the tunnel mouth remained. In the rapidly worsening light, Will couldn't make it out clearly. It looked like the body of a miner, but he couldn't be sure. Then the figure moved, and he realized that whoever it was, he was still alive. Chapter 19. Treading carefully, Will and Horace made their way across the narrow plank path that bridged the last 15 meters of the fissure. Will, with his excellent head for heights, could have run lightly across it without a problem, but he went slowly out of regard for his bigger, less nimble friend. When they finally made it to the finished roadway, Horace heaved a sigh of relief. Now they took a moment to examine the structure. It was built with all the thoroughness that Celts were famous for. As a nation, they had developed the art of tunneling and bridging over the centuries, and this was a typically sturdy structure. The smell of fresh sawn pine planking filled the cold night air, and overlaid on that, there was another sweetish aromatic smell. They looked at each other, puzzled, for a moment. Then Horace recognized it. "Tar," he said, and they looked around to see that the massive rope cables and supports were thick with the stuff. Will touched a hand on one, and it came away sticky. "I guess it prevents the ropes from fraying and rotting," he said carefully, noticing that the main cables were constructed of 3 heavy ropes twisted and plaited together, then thickly coated with a tar to protect them. Also, as the tar hardened, it would bind the 3 together more permanently. Horace glanced around. "No guards," he commented. There was a disapproving note in his voice. "They're either very confident or very careless," Will agreed. It was a full night now, and the moon was yet to rise. Will moved toward the eastern bank of the fissure. Loosening his sword in its scabbard, Horace followed him. The figure by the tunnel mouth lay as Will had last seen it. There had been no further sign of movement. The 2 boys approached him carefully now and knelt beside him, for now they could see that it was a Celt miner. His chest rose and fell, barely moving. "He's still alive," Will whispered. "Only just," Horace replied. He placed his forefinger to the Celt's neck to gauge the pulse there. At the touch, the man's eyes slowly opened, and he gazed up at the 2 of them, uncomprehending. Who you?" he managed to croak. Will unslung the water bottle from his shoulder and moistened the man's lips with a little of the liquid. The tongue moved greedily across the wetness, and the man croaked again, trying to rise on one elbow. "More." Gently, Will stopped him from moving and gave him a little more water. "Rest easy, friend," he said softly. "We're not going to harm you." It was obvious that somebody had done him harm, and plenty of it. His face was matted with dried blood that had been welled from a dozen whip cuts. His leather jerkin was shredded and torn, and his bare torso underneath showed signs of more whipping, recent and from long ago. "Who are you?" Will asked softly. "Glendus," the man sighed, seeming to wonder at the sound of his own name. Then he coughed, a racking, rattling cough that shook his chest. Will and Horace exchanged sad glances. Glendus didn't have long, they both realized. "When did you come here?" Will asked the man, gently allowing more water to trickle through the dried, cracked lips. "Months," Glendus replied in a voice they could barely hear. "Months and months I've been here, working on the tunnel." Again, the 2 boys looked at one another. Maybe the man's mind was wandering. "Months?" Will pressed him. "But the Wargle attacks only started a month ago, surely." But Glendus was shaking his head. He tried to speak, coughed and subsided, gathering his fading strength. Then he spoke, so softly that Will and Horace had to lean close to hear him. "They took us almost a year ago, from all over. Secretly. A man here, 2 men there, 50 of us in all. Most of the others dead by now. Me, soon." He stopped, gasping for breath again. The effort of speaking was almost too much for him. Will and Horace looked at each other, puzzling over this new information. "How was it that nobody knew this was happening?" Horace asked his friend. "I mean, 50 people go missing and nobody says anything?" But Will shook his head. He said they took them from villages all over Celtica. So 1 or 2 men going missing, people might talk about it locally, but nobody could see the entire picture. Still, said Horace, why do it? And why are they so open about it now? Will shrugged. Maybe we'll get an idea of that if we take a look around, he said. They hesitated uncertainly, not sure what they could do for the crumpled, battered form beside them. As they waited, the moon rose, soaring over the hills and flooding the bridge and the bank with soft, pale light. It touched on Glendus's face, and his eyes opened. Then he tried weakly to raise an arm to ward off the light. Gently, Will leaned forward to shield him. I'm dying, said the miner with a sudden clarity and a sense of peace. Will hesitated and then answered simply, Yes. It would have been no kindness to lie to him, to try to cheer him up along and protest that he would be all right. He was dying, and they all knew it. Better to let him prepare, to let him face death with dignity and calm. The hand clutched feebly at Will's sleeve, and he took it in his own, pressing it gently, letting the Celt feel the contact with another person. Don't let me die out here in the light. Again, Horace and Will exchanged glances. I want the peace of the out of light, he continued softly, and Will suddenly understood. I guess Celts like the darkness. They spend most of their lives in tunnels and mines, after all. Maybe that's what he wants. Horace leaned forward. Glendus, he said, do you want us to carry you into the tunnel? The miner's head had swiveled to Horace as the boy spoke. Now he nodded faintly, just enough for them to make out the action. Please, he whispered, take me to the out of light. Horace nodded to him, then slipped his arms under the Celt's shoulders and knees to lift him. Glendus was a small boned, and the weeks he had spent in captivity had obviously been a time of starvation for him. He was an easy burden for Horace to lift. As the warrior apprentice stood straight with Glendus cradled in his arms, Will motioned for him to wait. He sensed that once Glendus was in the peace of the dark tunnel, he would let go of the faint thread that held him to life. And there was still one more question Will needed answered. What do you think it is? Glendus, he said softly, how much time do we have? The miner looked at him wearily, uncomprehending. Will tried again. How long before they finish the bridge? He asked. This time he could see a light of understanding in the Celt's eyes. Glendus thought for a second or two. 5 days, he replied. Maybe 4. More workers came today, so maybe 4. Then his eyes closed as if the effort had been too much. For a second they thought he had died, but then his chest heaved with a massive shudder and he continued to breathe. Let's get him into the tunnel, Will said. They squeezed through the narrow opening. For the first 10 meters, the walls of the tunnel were close enough to touch. Then they began to widen as the result of the Celt's labor became evident. It was a dark, confined place, lit only by the dim flames of torches set in brackets every 10 to 12 meters. Some of these were guttering now and provided only a fitful, uncertain light. Horace looked around uneasily. He didn't like heights, and he definitely didn't like confined spaces. Here's the answer, Will said. Morgrath needed those first 50 miners to do this work. Now that the tunnel is nearly finished, he needs more men to get the bridge built as quickly as possible. Horace nodded. You're right, he agreed. The tunneling would take months, but nobody would see it was going on. Once they started building the bridge, the risk of discovery would be much higher. In the wider reaches of the tunnel, they found a small sandy patch, almost a grotto off to one side. They laid Glendus in it. Will realized that this must have been what the two Celts had been trying to do for their countrymen when the stop-work horn had sounded. He hesitated. I wonder what the Wargos will think when they find him here tomorrow. Horace merely shrugged. Maybe they think he crawled in here by himself, he suggested. Will thought about it doubtfully, but then when he looked at the peaceful expression on the dying miner's face in the gloomy light, he couldn't bring himself to take the man back outside once more. Just put him in a little further, in as far as sight as you can, he said. Out of sight as you can. There was a small elbow of rock, and Horace gently placed the miner behind it. He was now visible only if you looked carefully, and Will decided that was good enough. Horace stepped back into the main tunnel. Will noticed that he was still glancing uneasily around. What do we do now? Horace asked, and Will came to a decision. You can wait here for me, he said. I'm going to see where this leads. Horace didn't argue. The thought of going further into that dark, winding tunnel didn't appeal to him at all. He found a place to sit, close to one of the brighter torches. Just make sure you come back, he said. I don't want to have to come looking for you. And that's where I'm stopping, but it's getting good. All right, have a good day. And have a Merry Christmas and a wonderful break, because this is the last one before we shut her down for about a week.